All right, my name is Daniel Vacanti. Actually, you know what? I've got a prop that I forgot about that I need for my introduction. So, in case you guys are wondering who I am and why you should be hanging out in my session, I ran the world's first Kanban project, certainly as laid down by David Anderson. And for those of you who don't know who David Anderson is literally the guy who wrote the book on Kanban and applying lean, a practical, pragmatic way of applying lean thinking to software development. I've known David for over 12 years. I don't know if I should admit to that in public, but I've known David for over 12 years. I was at the world's, as I mentioned, the world's first project implementation of Kanban at a company called Corbis back in Seattle in 2006, 2007. How many people have heard of the company Corbis? A couple people. Any photographers in the room? No? Those people, probably the people who've heard of Corbis are the photographers. How many people have heard of Getty Images? Just a little bit more. Corbis is a direct competitor to Getty. They do exactly the same thing. They do the licensing of photography and digital rights management for photography and things like that. Corbis is owned by a company. I always pronounce his name wrong. Jim Hood. Raise your hand. Yeah. Jim Hood has to correct me on the pronunciation. This guy's name is I think it's called Bill Gates. Is that right? Does that sound right to people? Anyway, like I said, I've known David Anderson for over 12 years. In 2006, he called me up and said, "Hey Dan, come on out to Seattle, and let's do this lean thing together." And of course, like an idiot, I said yes. And I've been doing Kanban coaching consulting ever since. You know what? I just put my clicker down somewhere. So that's me. I started Corporate Kanban back in it was late last year. And like I said, we do coaching, Kanban coaching, training, and consulting all over the world. So this is going to be a very brief introduction. Obviously, we've only got an hour. There's no way we're going to make you guys all experts in lean thinking and Kanban over the next hour. But a couple of things you should know about my presentations. One, I like to pace and I like to flail, so I hope that doesn't give anybody any motion sickness or seasickness or anything like that. The number two thing is that I prefer to keep these things as informal as possible. So as we go along, if you guys have questions, raise your hand, throw something at me. I tell this joke all the time, but it's true. I was in Philadelphia, somebody threw a shoe at me to get my attention. So I know maybe you guys are a little bit more well-behaved here in Columbus. But whatever you need to do to get my attention, please do. If I'm going too fast on something, you guys want to spend a little bit more time on a topic, I think we're going to have enough time for questions. So let's please keep this as informal as possible. And then I have some time reserved at the end for questions as well. So you guys thought that you're going to be able to sit here and actually sit back and hear me talk for an hour. Well, that's not true. I'm probably going to ask you guys as many questions as you're going to ask me. And the first question I'm going to ask, other than has anyone heard of Corbis, the first question that I'm going to ask is, how many people know about Kanban or lean thinking or things like that? Okay, all right. I'm going to still kind of do a very quick introduction to it. It looks like maybe roughly half the crowd in here has heard of this. But I want to do a quick introduction. I like to start off most of my presentations with this slide. To be honest with you, it gets mixed reviews, but I think it's a good way to get you guys introduced to some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation. So this is a very, very, very simple example Kanban board. And I want to stress the fact that this is an example. Kanban is very context specific. So your mileage may vary. When you guys set up Kanban in your particular company, your board may actually look a lot different than this. But this is a good example for illustrating some of the points of Kanban. And the first thing that I want to point out are these different colored squares. These different colored squares represent work item types, the types of work that are flowing through your system, the different individual units of value that are flowing through your system at any given time. And the reason that we're showing this as different colored squares on a white background is the de facto standard for a Kanban implementation is putting up Post-its on a whiteboard, as most of you probably know. The second thing that I want to talk about is you can see that the board itself here has been segmented into these columns. And these columns represent the different steps of knowledge discovery, of work, of whatever, that these work item types are going to flow through. These steps represent that workflow that these work item types flow through. And you can see this particular example, it starts with input, work starts with input and flows all the way through into production. Again, in your particular company, it may be different. The last thing, and probably the most important thing that I want to talk about, are these red numbers at the top of these columns. I don't know, everybody can see my laser pointer, I'm hoping. These red numbers at the tops of these columns. These red numbers represent what are called work in progress or WIP limits, WIP, work in progress or WIP limits. And they represent how many of these squares can be in a column at any given time. Now, by limiting our work in progress this way, we create what's called a pull system. P-U-L-L, a pull system. Pull systems are one of the key tenets in Kanban because they are very, very different than push systems. My guess is those of you who, for most of your careers, even if you're doing Agile right now, but certainly before you were doing Agile, are very familiar with push systems, not pull systems. You guys are very familiar with push systems. Push systems are, work something like, work gets pushed onto you whether you're ready for it or not. Right? Your manager comes and does a drive-by and says, drop whatever you're working on, I need you to do this. Right? Those pesky customers call up and said, hey, I need this order filled by the end of the day today. Or your CEO goes on CNBC and announces a product that you guys are going to deliver by the end of the year, but oh yeah, by the way, he never told you guys about it. Right? Those are examples of push systems. By limiting work in progress like this in Kanban, we create what's called a pull system. Pull systems are very important because what that means is that at any step in this workflow, in these columns, the team cannot be overloaded. And the way pull systems work is downstream steps pull work in only when they have capacity to do so. And that capacity is represented by these red numbers, these work in progress limit numbers here. And the way it works is something like this. So you can see in the test column right here, we have a work in progress limit of 2. There's only 1 ticket in there. That means that's a signal that test has capacity to do work. So they're going to pull something in from build ready. Build ready, likewise, now has a work in progress limit of 2, so they can pull something in from development. Development has a work in progress limit of 4. You'll see that this 4 spans both in progress and done. We can talk about that later, why that is a little bit later. But development has a work in progress limit of 4. There are 4 tickets in here. That means that development can't start anything new. That doesn't mean that they can't continue to work on stuff that they're working on right now, stuff that's in progress, but they can't start anything new. So they can continue working on stuff they've already got in progress, but not pull anything new in. Development ready, likewise, has a work in progress limit of 3. There's only 3 things in there. They can't pull anything new in. Analysis, hopefully you guys are getting kind of the gist of this here. Analysis has a work in progress limit of 4. There's only 3 things in there. They can pull something in, and then you can replenish your ready queue. What I've just demonstrated here with this simple example is the flow of work in this system from left to right. Right? Again, this is an example Kanban system, so you guys can show flow however you want to, top to bottom, right to left, however you want to. Right? Like I said, I just wanted to do this as kind of a level setting of what Kanban is and what it's about. Are there any questions about this before we move on? Yes, over here. Okay, so the question is, if they're all in the done column, so like here in particular in development done, if all the tickets are in the done column, why can't development pull in any more work? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Why would we purposely limit our work in the done column?
Not inspected yet.
It's not potentially not inspected yet? Potentially, yeah. I mean, certainly we would need to understand what our definition of done for it to be in done. And that might be something, but there's maybe another reason.
It means that you could have an unlimited backlog building up behind it if you just kept allowing things to grow and grow.
Yeah, so the point was you could have an unlimited backlog of things behind it growing. I mean, this thing could grow unlimited, and that's essentially the point. Imagine, so if we're talking about in development here, imagine that we did not limit our done column right here. And let's say that, for example, test was our bottleneck. Well, if development was getting stuff done faster than test can get stuff done, By not limiting our done column here, then you can see that stuff could continue to pile up and pile up and pile up and pile up in done, thus essentially defeating the purpose of limiting our work in progress anyway. You can see you have that explosion of work in progress in that unlimited work column. So that's a great answer. Any other questions about this? A couple of them.
So does it mean when you have bandwidth there in development, you move to test? Like people in development, they do testing? I mean, is that what you're trying to imply?
Are you saying, so the question was, if there's bandwidth in development, you should move people to test? Was that the question? Yeah. If development is all done and there's work to be done in test? Is that?
So you have a WIP limit of 4, right?
Yeah, there you go.
So you have a WIP limit of 4 in development. In test you have 2.
Yep.
Right? And just expanding onto the question that the previous gentleman asked, if you are having all the cards done in development, what would those guys do?
Yep. Okay. Right. So if everything's done in development, we've got supposedly developers sitting around idle. The point is, does that mean that they should move over to test?
Or what should they?
Right. Yeah. That's exactly a great question. As we're going to see here in the next few slides, Kanban at its simplest is about enabling you to ask the right questions. It's about provoking a conversation. So, if we have a case here in development, for example, where everything was in done, all 4 tickets were in done, and development couldn't start anything new, and there were a whole bunch of developers sitting around idle, that should provoke a conversation. How did we get to this point where we have our developers with everything done and they can't pull anything new in? And the answers to those questions could be, yeah, maybe we need development to go over and help test. That's absolutely a correct option. Maybe our WIP limit in development is too low. Maybe they have much more capacity than what we're giving them credit for. What else is possibly going wrong in this workflow that allows us, or that could allow us to optimize that flow a little bit better? So that's really that question there really kind of gets to the heart of the difference between a pull system and a push system. A push system puts an emphasis on starting things, whereas a pull system puts an emphasis on completing things. And so if stuff can't get completed, the last thing I wouldn't say one of the last things we want to do is actually start stuff. We want to understand why aren't things getting completed.
So if the developers are idle, but test only has a WIP of 2 and build ready only has a WIP of 2, so you're assuming that that's because that's how much work the existing test crew can get done. So you can't just throw developers at it because they still can't have more than 2 cards in test. So then can you do a temporary increase in the WIP to push those cards through to tag onto?
Right, yeah. And so actually, I'll probably answer this one, and we maybe should defer this deeper conversation to later, because these are all really great questions. But to answer that, these work in progress limits should represent the capacity of the team at any given step. So what this work in progress limit of 2 is saying that our test team only has capacity to work on 2 things at a time. Now, yeah, if we move to developers over to test, would it be fair to temporarily violate that WIP limit or even increase that WIP limit? Potentially, but maybe not. Maybe we just want to temporarily move developers over to relieve this logjam in test. And this is actually not meant to be a slight on test, by the way. A lot of people, I think, get angry at me because of, with this type of example. This is really not meant to be a slight on test. It's actually meant to be more of a slight on developers. I can say that because I'm a recovering Java developer, 12 years sober. Thank you very much. So let's maybe, I'll probably come back to this a little bit later. We can talk about these questions in detail in just a little bit, but I want to get through the rest of this talk and give you some background on lean thinking. So, Successful Evolutionary Change for Your Technology Business is the subtitle of David's book. And I was one of the primary reviewers on the book, and we actually went back and forth on this title, what this title should be. The first one was Successful Change for Your Technology Business, and then the second one was Evolutionary Change, and then finally we compromised on Successful Evolutionary Change. And the reason that we wanted to go with a title like this was because of the problem of introducing new concepts or just change in general in an organization. most organizations, when they want to do change, go through these very, very large managed change initiatives. Most of us in here have probably been through one of these things. And David in particular, and I was fortunately, unfortunately, along for the ride for some of these things, has been involved in major change, managed change initiatives over the past decade. And what we notice is when organizations go through these managed change initiatives, they go through what's known as a J-curve effect. Right? I was talking to a vice president a couple months ago, actually. He called this the valley of despair. And what the J-curve effect looks like is something like this. Let's say that we can measure a team's productivity over time. And let's say a team is cruising along at some level of productivity right here. Right? And let's say this team is doing traditional waterfall or something like that. Right? And a senior manager comes in, or a CIO or whomever comes in and says, you know what, this level of productivity is great, but we really need to be up here somewhere. So you know what, starting tomorrow, we're going to do Scrum. Forget that waterfall stuff. We're going to do Scrum. We're going to change job roles. We're going to change how you work. We're going to introduce time boxes. We're going to do all these things. Right? What do you think is going to happen to the productivity of that team in the short term? It's going to go down. Right? It's going to go down until the team finally gets comfortable with the concept of this change. Hopefully they get comfortable with that concept of this change. It bottoms out, and then finally you get up to where you need to be. It's at this point of the presentation that I like to talk about golf. Any golfers in the room? Or golf fans or anything? Hopefully people have heard of Tiger Woods. You guys have heard of Tiger Woods, hopefully? Yeah? I keep threatening to update this for Tiger Woods' personal J-curve that he's going through right now. We're not going to be talking about his personal J-curve, although he is starting to win again, so evidence would suggest that maybe he's back up here. No, I want to talk about Tiger Woods when he first burst onto the scene, way back in the late 90s. I think it was 97, 98. I don't know if you guys remember this. When he first came onto the scene, he won the Masters tournament. The Masters is one of the most prestigious golf tournaments in the world. He won the Masters tournament by 12 strokes. Everybody remember this? It was either 19 or 20 or 21. Just came and blew the field away. Won the Masters tournament by 12 strokes. Does anybody know what Tiger Woods did almost immediately after winning the Masters? I heard it. What was that?
Changed his stroke.
He changed his swing. He hired a new swing coach and he changed his swing. Right? Another thing that I need to do, I need to find some old interviews of Tiger Woods back then. But he changes his swing, and the press gives him no end of grief, right? Because the press is like, Tiger, you just won the Masters by 12 strokes. What the heck are you doing changing your swing? Because what happened to Tiger almost immediately after he changed his swing? Wait, what's that? The pit of despair, yeah. Yeah, he started losing everything. He wins the Masters, and then he starts losing everything. Until finally, I think it was 2000, 2001 or whatever, he wins what he called his Tiger Slam. That's where he won all 4 major tournaments in a row, not in the same year, but all 4 of them in a row. He started winning everything, right? And during that time when he was going through that adjustment period and he was losing everything, the press was giving him all kinds of grief because they were like, Tiger, why don't you go back to what you were doing before? You just won the Masters by 12 strokes. Why did you change your swing? Why the heck would you change your swing? I have to be a little bit careful on how I say this, but most organizations that we work with don't have the maturity of a Tiger Woods. Now I'm talking professionally, I'm not talking personally, I'm talking professionally. Tiger Woods understood that he was at this level of productivity when he won the Masters, but to be long-term successful on the tour, he needed to be somewhere like, up there, and he knew that he was going to have to go through some serious change in order to get to that level of productivity. Like I said, most organizations don't have that level of maturity. So what happens is, let's say we call the point at which that change is initiated. So the team's doing waterfall. The manager comes in and says, we're going to start doing Scrum. Let's call that point T1. Right? And so the team, as was suggested in the room, the team actually starts to get worse. In the short term, it actually starts to get worse. They actually start to get a lot worse. Right? And you start hearing things like, remember the good old days when we were doing waterfall? Right? Things were so much better. We were getting so much more stuff done. Things were so great when we were doing waterfall. And the reason you hear things like that is because it's absolutely true. Right? The team was better when they were doing waterfall before they were doing this Scrum stuff. So the team gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until finally you get to point T2, this part of the curve. This is the part of the curve that David Anderson likes to refer to as change agent gets fired. Right? Because the organization can no longer absorb this decrease in productivity, right? The team is so happy, productivity is going down. They believe that this plane is in a nosedive and it's not going to be able to pull up, right? So they fire the change agent, and then most of the time, what do? What organizations do? They revert. Okay, so they revert. That's potentially one thing they do, but normally they'll do something else. They hire a consultant. Yes, that's actually what I was looking for. They'll try something else. They'll try another huge, big managed change effort, right? And so they'll start off here, and they'll go through another J curve, right? That's why most organizations that I go work with are actually getting worse over time rather than better, is because of this effect. So Kanban is about this idea. This is getting back to that subtitle of the book, Evolutionary Change. Kanban is about this idea of evolutionary change. What we don't necessarily want to do is one big, huge change. What we'd like to get to the point of is where we can do small changes over time. So we're going through mini J curves in order to get better over time. This is the approach of evolutionary change with Kanban. I do a 2-day Kanban training class, and it's called Kanban training, but I want to rename it to just Dan's pet peeves. Because one of my biggest pet peeves is when lean consultants will come into your organization and they will wow you with their command of the Japanese language. Right? And they'll throw all these Japanese terms at you, and you're left in the audience sitting there wondering, okay, now was Muda waste, or was it Muri, or what's Gemba again, and all that kind of stuff. So I try to keep a lot of Kanban terms out of my presentations. I promise, no, I shouldn't say I promise. I'm going to try to only give you 2 Japanese terms for the course of this conversation. The first one, of course, is going to be Kanban, and we're going to talk about what that is in just a second. And the second thing that I want to talk to you about is Kaizen. Right? This is the idea of Kaizen. Small incremental changes, this idea of continuous improvement over time to continuously get better. Right? This is what we're talking about in Kanban, and Kanban is hopefully going to instill in your organization this idea of Kaizen. So, questions? Any questions about that? Well, I've already actually covered a couple of these topics, but like I talked about, Kanban is about provoking those right conversations. And most importantly, it's about provoking the right conversations around the best economic outcome for your organization. And hopefully this will become a little bit more apparent as we go on. The subtitle of my Kanban training actually probably should be Context is King, because Kanban is very contextually specific. It's about giving you guys a set of principles and practices that you guys will apply to your particular organization so that you can get better. It's not necessarily about throwing a prescriptive method at you and saying do this and you'll get better. Right? Okay, so what is this whole Kanban thing? Anybody been to Tokyo? By the way, Tokyo? Okay, one person, thank God. I haven't been. I keep using this example. I've never been. I stole this example from David. So you can correct me if I'm wrong. And this example is actually, it's a good 10 or 12 years old, so maybe it's changed in the time that I've been using it. But anyway, hopefully everybody recognizes this as a cherry tree during cherry blossom season. And what the Japanese like to do during cherry blossom season is they like to go and sit and have a picnic under the cherry blossoms. And they like to stare up at the cherry blossoms and reflect on the fragility of life. Right? One of their favorite places to do this is in the Imperial Palace Gardens in the center of Tokyo. I don't know if you went to the Imperial Palace Gardens when you were there. Okay, thank God. So at the Imperial Palace Gardens, when you want to go, you'll queue up front, and when you get to the front of the queue, you're handed one of these white admission tickets. Now, no money changes hands. You're just handed one of these tickets. And when all the tickets get handed out, nobody else can go in until somebody leaves the gardens. And when you leave the gardens, you hand in your ticket, and the ticket gets recycled, and somebody else can come in. Right? Why do you think the managers of the Imperial Palace Gardens would implement a system like this? The number of trees, right? Yeah, I mean, what's the point? If there are only so many trees for, say, 100 people at a given time, what would be the point of shoving 1,000 or 10,000 people in there at any given time? Absolutely correct. What else?
It's a really easy way to keep track of your capacity. You can only let in people for the number of tickets you have. then you don't need any big complicated systems to track it.
Right, it's a real easy way to track capacity. So we know, if we know that the gardens only have capacity for 100 people, I know by handing out these tickets that there's only ever 100 people in these gardens at any given time. That has a side effect, a side added effect of if there's any security reason, for any security reason that they need to evacuate the gardens, they know that there are 100 people or however many tickets that they've given out at any given time. And so when they evacuate the gardens, they know that, hey, I need to get 86 people out of these gardens. Absolutely. Maybe I should have, Jim tells me that I should update the example for a, clubbing in New York, night clubbing in New York. Maybe that give you guys a little bit better idea. No, it's the same type of principle. Why else do you think that they would do? There's all kinds of reasons. Anyone else? Yeah. Limit damage to the gardens, right? Yeah. I mean, again, if we only have so much capacity for people, imagine if you've got 10,000 people. Running through these gardens, if there's only capacity for 1,000 or 100 or whatever, what do you think the experience of these people would be, if they were constantly getting hit by people or run over by people or whatever, right? So as you guys probably have figured out, what the Imperial Palace Gardens here have implemented is a very, very simple Kanban system. Kanban is a Japanese word that means visual card or token. These white admission tickets, whoops. If I go the right way, these white admission tickets are known as Kanban. And what they've implemented here is a very, very simple pull system by limiting their work in progress with these things. Next question. Can anybody tell me who this guy is? Mr. Kanban? Close. Anybody have a more specific guess? What? I don't know if I should do this because Bob actually I think has been to one of my talks before, but I'm going to give Bob a book for knowing that this is a picture of a guy. His name is Taiichi Ohno, and he's known as the father of the Toyota production system. Now I'm Italian, I would call him the godfather of the Toyota production system, but most people call him the father of the Toyota production system. Taiichi Ohno, hopefully it doesn't surprise you, Taiichi Ohno is Japanese. In fact, he'd probably been to the Imperial Palace Gardens. This idea of Kanban and limiting your work in progress using visual cards was actually fairly pervasive in the Japanese culture. And one of his key insights was to use this concept in manufacturing. Now, I don't necessarily want to talk about that right now. What I want to do is I want to talk about a story about Taiichi Ohno and the historical accuracy of this anecdote. Could be called into question, but it's a good story nonetheless. It is said that when Taiichi Ohno was first thinking about applying things like Kanban to manufacturing, one of the very first things that he did is he came over to America to study American supermarkets. Now this is back in the 1940s. Why do you suppose in the 1940s a Japanese manufacturing guy wanted to come over and study how Americans ran their supermarkets? I told you guys thought you'd be able to sit back and not answer any questions. Yeah?
American supermarkets stock the shelves just in time?
American supermarkets stock their shelves just in time. Yes, can you say just a little bit more? Why do they stock their shelves just in time?
Because nobody wants to buy spoiled milk.
Because nobody wants to buy spoiled milk, right. In the 1940s especially, what was peculiar to supermarkets' inventory? Well, lack of it, but you just said it with the spoiled milk. It's perishable, right? Absolutely, it's perishable, right? And so how long do you think a supermarket would stay in business if it constantly stocked its shelves with food that nobody wanted or more food than people could possibly ever buy, right? There's no way that they would ever stay in business. Now, I did an MBA 10 years ago, and I normally tell the story that I slept through all my accounting classes. It's not true. I skipped them all. But that's why I married an accountant. But if my wife were here, she would tell you that traditional financial accounting treats inventory as an asset. The key insight to lean thinking is to treat inventory as a liability. Why is inventory a liability? Because inventory is perishable, right? It is potentially going to go bad. And so if inventory is perishable, if inventory is a liability, that means that we only ever want to carry as much as we possibly need at any given at any given time and no more, because carrying anything more than that is waste. Right? In our Kanban system, that work in progress, those tickets that we showed flowing through the system, those represent our work in progress. Right? And so that's why we want to make sure that we are only carrying as much work in progress as we need at any given time, because anything more than that is waste. Right? I'm not going to throw, I am a math major, but I'm hopefully not going to throw a whole bunch of math at you, but I did want to throw this relationship up for you. And there's a relationship, going along this theme of work in progress. Too much work in progress is bad. There's a relationship between cycle time and work in progress. And it's this relationship right here, where cycle time is how long it takes one item to go through the system. Work in progress is how many items are in the system at any given time. And throughput is how many items are produced per unit of time. This relationship is showing us not only is there an obvious relationship between cycle time and work in progress, but that relationship is very specific. It's that relationship is directly proportional. That is to say, all other things being equal, when your work in progress goes up, your cycle time goes up. Right? How many people in here do Scrum? What is the key metric that you look at in Scrum and during your retrospectives? Velocity, right? What has to have happened in order for me to know what my velocity is? Work has to get done. Right? I don't know how fast I'm going. I don't know how many story points I got done during my sprint or my iteration until I've actually finished the iteration. Then I can look back and I can see how fast I was going. I can see what my velocity was. That makes velocity a lagging indicator, what's known as a lagging indicator. But by this relationship, I've just told you, the second that I increase my work in progress, I can guarantee, pretty much guarantee, an increase in my cycle time. I can guarantee that it's going to take me longer to get stuff done. So if velocity is a lagging indicator, what does that make work in progress in terms of an indicator? Sorry? A current, a real time, or even potentially even a leading indicator. In terms of metrics, in terms of software metrics especially, you don't get leading indicators. It's one of the reasons why work in progress as a metric is such a crucial metric to keep track of, because well, I don't necessarily want to go there. We can maybe talk a little bit more about this. And I just gave away. This relationship is known as Little's Law. Right? I don't know if anybody has seen this before, but this relationship is known as Little's Law. It's one of the key tenets in lean thinking. John Little was a professor at, I think it was Case Reserve right now. It's called Case Western now, but before it was called Case Reserve. Is that right? I think so. In the early 60s. John Little isn't the one who discovered this, but he was the first one to prove it. This relationship's been known for actually, I don't know, decades. And John Little was the first one to prove it, and so that's why it's named after him. The last thing I want to say about lean in general is that most people will come and tell you, this is Dan's pet peeve number 2, we're at number 2, right, in terms of my pet peeves. Dan's pet peeve number 2 is most people will come in and they'll tell you, especially when you're doing a lean initiative, that lean is all about waste elimination. It drives me nuts when people say that. Unfortunately, it's because that's a hangover from the manufacturing industry, especially the American implementation of lean manufacturing. Because what most lean consultants will do, especially in the lean manufacturing world, is they'll come in and they'll look for piles of stuff on the shop floor. They'll walk around your plant and they'll just look for piles of stuff on your shop floor. And those piles represent inventory. And so the consultant will come in and they'll say, okay, well, that's inventory, that's waste, let's get rid of that. What you guys need to know is that there is what's known as this lean decision filter. And the lean decision filter says something like this, that value trumps flow and flow trumps waste elimination. So that while waste elimination is important, we're not going to eliminate waste to the point where we're sacrificing flow. Remember I showed you flow on that board earlier. We're not going to eliminate waste to the point where we sacrifice flow, and we're certainly not going to protect flow and waste elimination to sacrifice value. At the end of the day, it's about the efficient and effective delivery of value to the customer. And if that means that we need to introduce waste or break flow in order to deliver that value, we're absolutely going to do that. And my favorite example to show this is Federal Express. Now, Federal Express is, as most of you guys probably know, Federal Express offers several different classes of service for their packages. All of us could probably walk down to our local Federal Express office here and drop off a package to get shipped overnight, and it would almost certainly get there wherever we sent it to overnight. Now, I haven't used Federal Express a ton, but I can tell you every time that I've shipped a package overnight at Federal Express, it has gotten there the next day. Now, Federal Express has no idea. They have shops, I mean, obviously they have offices all over the country, really all over the world. But they have offices all over the country. They have no idea on any given day what customers, how many customers are going to show up in a given location, what the size of those packages are going to be, what the weight of those packages are going to be, et cetera, et cetera. So how is Federal Express able to offer that class of service that any one of us, or all of us, could walk into that Federal Express location and drop off a package and get shipped overnight? How do you suppose they're able to do that? Excess capacity, that is exactly right. That is, do you work for Federal Express or UPS or anything like that? No. Excess capacity is exactly right. At any given time, Federal Express has empty planes flying in the air. I believe they also have empty trucks driving around too. So let's say that 10,000 packages show up in Minneapolis, 10,000 overnight packages show up in Minneapolis. What they do is they divert one of those empty planes down to Minneapolis, pick up all those packages and go. Now imagine if the CFO was myopically focused on this waste elimination concept. If the CFO was just looking at waste elimination, do you think that CFO would ever allow empty planes to be circling in the air, or empty trucks to be driving on the ground? Absolutely not, because those empty planes represent waste, technically waste, right? That's jet fuel that's being used. That's pilot time that we have to pay for. That's maintenance on the planes that we have to pay for, right? There's a ton of waste, right? But Federal Express has understood, has learned that to deliver that customer value, they actually have to introduce waste into the system in order to protect that value. So this is another thing that I want you guys to think about, as you're going through. Hopefully, some of you will take up a lean transformation. Something that you guys will think about is that a lean transformation is not just about waste elimination. It's about understanding flow and the value of flow through the system. Any questions about that? All of this is leading to our 5 principles of Kanban. I wanted to get to this. I know this talk is about lean thinking, but really, in terms of adoption, in terms of pragmatism, Kanban, certainly as written by David in his book, is the method that has the most momentum behind it right now. And there are five principles behind Kanban, and those are to visualize work, to limit work in progress, manage flow. Sometimes this is seen as measure and manage flow. 4th is make process policies explicit. And the 5th is to improve collaboratively using models. And these are models like the theory of constraints or Shewhart and Deming's theory of variability. There's all kinds of models out there that we can use to improve the way that our system functions. Right? The visualize work and limit work in progress, you guys saw that on that board earlier. The measure and manage flow, this is about taking a metrics or scientific-based approach to managing our projects. Making process policies explicit. The reason we make our process policies explicit is because our process policies, turns out, are one of the largest sources of variability in our system. Our process policies are the rules by which we play our software development game, and they're one of the largest sources of variability in our system. I wish we had more time to talk about that because that's probably a key point. And the 5th one, of course, improve collaboratively. When I go around and I talk to companies, a lot of times I hear, Dan, we're not really seeing the benefits from Kanban that we really think that we should be seeing. And when I go in and look at what they're doing, it's usually they're up here playing around at the shallow end of the pool. With Kanban, there's not necessarily a correct or incorrect implementation. It's all about how shallow or deep are you going with your implementation. So when I talk to those companies that are having problems, usually they might have some post-it notes up on a whiteboard, maybe. And they might be limiting their work in progress, but if they are, they're not taking those work in progress limits too seriously. And so they're up here. And so it's when people do like that, of course you're not going to see the benefits from Kanban that you might expect. To really see the full benefit of this approach, you have to go deep. You have to hit all 5 of these things. shameless plug. I just want to say this very quickly. It's a very shameless plug. If anybody wants to play around with Kanban, get your feet wet with this thing, we have an online game that you can play. It's an online simulation where you can actually run a real Kanban board. There's a scenario that we've set up, and you can play that. You can go to getkanban.corporatekanban.com if anybody's interested. It shows all of the principles that we've just talked about here. So that was pretty much everything that I wanted to get through so far. But I'd like to talk about questions. I'd like to have some questions. Yeah.
So what do you do in the sense when, or how would you do it working with teams when you use story points and one card might be much larger than another card? So if you do limits on just the number of cards, obviously the effort behind each of those cards is different.
Yeah, so we get this question a lot. That's a really, really good question. So one of the first questions I always hear is with these work in progress limits here is a question of, if I have a work in progress limit of 4, say here on analysis, does that mean that all the things in analysis are roughly the same size? And the answer to that is no. It might shock you, but the answer to that is no. It's very easy to design a Kanban system, and I would argue that most if not all Kanban systems are designed to be able to handle that type of variability. So you're saying, this particular story, this particular card might represent a user story, and it might be 2 points, and this card right here might be, I don't know, 13 or 15 or 20 some points or whatever. Is that kind of an implicit breakage of the work in progress limit, or does that invalidate our Kanban system? And the answer is absolutely not. And I don't know that we have enough time to get into this, and I wish we did. But with Kanban and this emphasis on flow, this variability in size really ends up being not that important. In fact, I don't necessarily want to say that, but what I do want to say is that variability in size is probably not the variability that's killing you. And spending a whole bunch of time trying to break this stuff down into similar size stuff rather than focusing on the flow of value through the system is potentially misguided. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I do want to say that this system does not depend on these things being the same size. It is still possible to see flow, even though this may be a small number of story points and this may be a large number of story points. But yet they still count equally against the work in progress limit. Now, just kind of in addition to that, I would say this: I personally do not have experience with this, but I have heard of teams doing this. So I'm not recommending it, but it's something you guys might want to play around with. But I've heard of teams that will set their work in progress limit based on story points. Right? So they'll say, in analysis, that we can only have 20 story points in progress at any given time. I don't know if that'll work or not, but it's an interesting idea, interesting thought. Sorry, next question.
2 questions. What about rework? So let's say you get to test and then somebody discovers, so that's rework, but your development is flow. And then the second question, what about, let's say, disruptive work that comes in from outside? So let's say your team is responsible for production support. They're not solely in this kind of stream. That's not the only thing they do.
Right. Let me answer the rework question first, because it's kind of hard to see on here. I know I'm not going back to the shameless plug. It's kind of hard to see up here. But in this board design right here, there's reserved space up here. This board has been segmented into a swim lane, and this swim lane is known as an expedite row. It's really, really hard to see, but this word right here says expedite. And so that's in the case of where something comes in from outside, and we just have to push it through the system, regardless of what we're working on right now. I mean, obviously this is going to happen from time to time. And that's how a lot of teams will handle that, is via this type of expedite row. A lot of times teams will even go so far as to say that stuff in this expedite row is allowed to violate work in progress limits. I have to be very, very careful with that, and start to put some pretty stringent rules in terms of what really makes it into that expedite lane and how we limit our work in progress there. But that's what a lot of teams will do. This is a bit of a soapbox of mine, so I don't necessarily want to go there. But if your team does production support and things like that, that might be a solution for you. In terms of rework, you've got a couple of options. Most teams that I see with rework, what they'll do is they'll put, there's not an example here, but the kind of the de facto standard of showing that work is blocked on a Kanban board is with a pink Post-it note. And whenever you see one of these work item types with a pink Post-it note on top of it, that means that that item is blocked, that no work is getting done on it for whatever reason. So if there's rework, say something gets a test and there's a bug or something that needs to be fixed, what will normally happen is that a pink ticket will get put on that card, and that pink ticket will represent the defect. Right? That's one option. Another option is you could have this ticket flow back into development. There's no reason why you couldn't pick up that ticket and say, you know what, this thing's not ready for test, it's got to go back into development. If that happens, you almost certainly will violate your development work in progress limit. And again, remember, Kanban is about provoking these conversations. When I violate my WIP limit, we should have a conversation about why the heck did I violate my work in progress limit. That's another option for you. Another thing that people will do is they will make bugs or defects a first-class work item type item. You know, they might give it their own separate color or whatever. And whenever those defects are found, they might even send them all the way back to the beginning to get reprioritized against other work. So those are just kind of 3 quick options for you in terms of rework. That's a great question. Anything? Yeah.
So my question is just around the blockers you were talking about. So if we have a blocker, do we put back in the queue, or you want to keep it hanging there in the development? So what do you?
Yeah. So the question is about blocker. When we have something blocked, so say we had a pink ticket or something on that test thing. Again, it's about the principle number 1 in Kanban. Those 5 principles is make work visible. Those blockages are work, or implicit work. And so we definitely want to. One of the reasons we put a pink ticket on it is because if you put a pink ticket on it, imagine there were 20 pink tickets on this board. You could stand back from this board at like 20 or 30 feet, and you'd be able to tell that there's a whole lot of stuff going wrong with this board. You might not know exactly what's going on, but you'd know that there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. That's why a lot of people like using that pink blocker as your ticket. So we definitely want to keep it on the board, and we definitely want it to keep it counting against that work in progress limit, because again, it's about provoking that conversation. Why isn't work getting done on this thing? That pink blocker represents work not flowing through the system. Why isn't that work flowing through the system? It should provoke that type of conversation.
I'm sorry. Could you go back to the slide with the 5 things, the shallow, deep pool thing?
Yep.
Can you elaborate a little bit on number 4? Just give a good example of that.
Yeah. So number 4 is, let me go back to this. Number 4 would be there are already all kinds of things on this board already that we are making our process policies explicit. One is the fact that we've got work in progress limits set on each of these columns. That is a process policy. We're saying that only 4 things can be in progress at any given time. But more specifically, what a lot of teams will do is they will, either at the bottom of the columns or at the tops of the columns, they will list either the activities that happen, say, in analysis or development, or what the done criteria is for analysis or development, or what the pull criteria is. So they'll have a set of things that in analysis our test scripts have to be written. Maybe our acceptance tests have to be written. Some type of analysis has to be done. In development, your policies might be it has to be unit tested. It has to be obviously checked in, and you haven't broken the build. If you're doing something cool like a type-safe language. Right? Those are examples of making process policies explicit. Does that make sense? Right. Yeah. You've had your hand up for a while, haven't you?
How do you recommend defining your work in process limits when you start?
Yeah. So the question is, how do you define them? How the heck do we come up with these work in progress limits? And there's obviously all kinds of theory behind this on how you might do this. But a lot of times, the simplest way to do it is to just have a simple count of how many people maybe you have in development or analysis or whatever, and talk about how many things you want them working on at a given time. So say maybe you only want your developers working on 2 things at a time. If you have 10 developers and you only want them working on 2 things at a time, then a simple work in progress might be you set a limit of 20 in development. If you're doing pairing, obviously, then you cut that in half. You'd set that limit at 10. You might even want to ratchet it down a little bit lower than that. But as a simple rule of thumb, that's a lot of times simple enough really to get you going is some type of policy like that.
Do you factor time into WIP limits at all?
Do you factor time into work in progress limits at all? Yep. The short answer is no. The longer answer is maybe. Really, what we're talking about here in Kanban is this flow of end-to-end value, of really start to finish value. So I haven't talked about this a lot, and shame on me for not talking about this. But one of the biggest reasons why we visualize our work in progress, why we visualize our work like this, and in this particular example, you can see that they're visualizing from analysis all the way through to production. That's because we want to introduce this idea of systems thinking or systemic thinking, in that there's no point in optimizing how we do work in development if by optimizing work in development we actually put a strain on test or we put a strain on analysis. Right? What we want to concern ourselves with is the global flow of value through the system instead of optimizing locally. It's a big thing, global optimization over local optimization. Yet another thing I wish we had more time to spend time on. So
You've got about 20 minutes.
I've got about yeah, I need about 2 days for that one though. That's why initially teams focus on this kind of end-to-end. When we talk about that cycle time for Little's Law, it's generally the end-to-end, the start to finish. Now, it could be that you get in and you see that development is taking quite a bit of time. So at that point, we might want to understand what our cycle time through development is, or what our cycle time through test is, or what our cycle time through analysis is. We might go so far as then, but to me, that's more of a mature behavior. Really, it's about understanding what that cycle time is through the whole system, and figuring out how we can make adjustments for that cycle time there, for that global cycle time.
So does Kanban use things such as a backlog or retrospective and show and tell, and if so, when does that fit into this process?
Yeah. I guess this is turning into like kind of a mini Kanban, I don't know, workshop or something. So I want to maybe treat those separately, the idea of a backlog and the idea of a retrospective. So, sorry, was everybody in here familiar with Scrum? Is that right? Everybody in? Okay. Let's talk about cadence first. This is one of the key differences between Kanban and Scrum. And by the way, I'm not one of those guys that is an us versus them type of thing. A lot of times you'll see on either the Kanban forums or Scrum forums or whatever. It's all about Kanban against Scrum. Either you're doing Kanban or you're doing Scrum. To me, it's not about Kanban or Scrum or Kanban versus Scrum. To me, it's more about Kanban and Scrum or Kanban and Agile. I don't see the two as mutually exclusive at all. I've worked with a lot of teams that use both. To me, these are all really kind of just tools in your toolbox, and you guys decide what's the best tool for you for your particular context. Now, there are different philosophical approaches, and it's kind of interesting to talk about what those philosophical approaches are. One of those philosophical approaches being this idea of cadence. In Scrum, the time box is key, right? And in this time box, in your iteration, in your sprint, you do things like iteration planning, and you do retrospectives, and you do user demos, and you do your work, right? All of these ideas, all of these concepts are coupled together in the idea of an iteration or a sprint, right? The approach that Kanban takes is to decouple those things, because each one of those activities has a transaction cost. There's a transaction cost for iteration planning. There's a transaction cost for retrospectives. There's a transaction cost for user demo. And to say that the transaction costs for all of those are all the same and that they should be lumped together in an arbitrary, and I mean arbitrary in the best way, but in an arbitrary time box, potentially is counterproductive. So the approach that Kanban takes is say, you should let those activities float to their natural level of frequency. If it makes sense to do planning every week, then do it every week. If it makes sense to do user demos every 2 weeks, then do them every 2 weeks. If it makes sense to do retrospectives every 3 weeks, then do them every 3 weeks. But understand what that natural frequency is based on your transaction costs, but still keep in place this idea of cadence. So if you're going to do planning every week, then do planning every week. If you're going to do retrospectives every 3 weeks, then do them every 3 weeks. Still have that idea of a cadence. The idea of cadence doesn't necessarily go away. Now, with respect to a backlog, backlog is one of my least favorite words in the English language, and I have to explain why. I think that most people connote, is that how you pronounce it? Is that how you would say it? Connote? The backlog with two things, both a commitment and a priority. And so Kanban, the way Kanban handles commitment and priority are a little bit differently. We talked about this idea of just-in-time, and with Kanban, what we're really talking about is a just-in-time commitment. And in Kanban, that just-in-time commitments happens, in this particular example, when a ticket hits this input queue. So there may be some candidate repository of all the things that we need to work on. We're not going to call it a backlog, of course. We're just going to call it some candidate repository of things that we may need to work on. I wish I could go all the way back to the beginning. But let's say that there are only 2 tickets in our input queue, and we get to our weekly planning meeting. The way the weekly planning meeting goes something like this. We've got 2 things in our input queue. We've got capacity for 5. What are the next 3 things that we're going to work on? So in a just-in-time manner, we're going to look through our whole repository, right, not a backlog, our candidate repository, and pull in the next 3 things that we should be working on. And we don't spend any time prioritizing whatever that repository is. We just do that in kind of a just-in-time manner. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? It's kind of if you think in terms of iterations, it's really kind of hard to get away from that. But that's really what we're talking about. But the thing is, the key is, once we've put that ticket on our board, then that represents our commitment with kind of a little c, that this work item type will flow through the whole system and pop out the other end. It will get done. Any other questions? Something up here? Yeah?
What's the number 5 on the 5 principles?
What was the number 5? It was improve collaboratively using models?
Give an example of the model.
Yep, so a classic model that people like to use in terms of improving their Kanban system is the theory of constraints. It's honestly not one of my favorites because I think a lot of people jump to it too quickly and use it kind of as a crutch. But the theory of constraints is an excellent example of a model that people might use for Kanban. So, you know, the theory of constraints might say if we have a systemic bottleneck, say we've identified a systemic bottleneck in test, what are some of the things that we can do to work within the bounds of that bottleneck? There's a whole bunch of literature and theory out there around the theory of constraints that would allow us to do that. So that's an example of a number 5, right? And there's all kinds of other models that we might apply to Kanban in order to work.
And I have a question that tails into that. Earlier you talked about the J-curve and changing the one big J into many small incremental changes. Can you connect that back to the actual application of Kanban and maybe walk through some examples of the kinds of changes over time that you might make that are small, given a system of work and process?
It's a great question. So with Kanban, we're going to start with what you do right now. Right? We're going to respect all of your roles and responsibilities. We're not going to change any job titles or anything like that. When we first come in and we model a Kanban board, what we're going to do is model exactly how you work right now. Not how you'd like to work sometime in the future, not how it says you're supposed to work in some standard operating procedure manual, but how you exactly work right now. And your first iteration of a Kanban board is going to be that. Right? So then in terms of little small changes that you're going to make over time is small changes to your work in progress limits over time, maybe small changes to these process policies, down or definitions of done at the bottom. So let's say right now you're not doing, let's say right now in analysis you're not doing something like acceptance test-driven development, but maybe we want to implement something like acceptance test-driven development. We can do something like that. Maybe there's a code review step in development that doesn't need to be done anymore based on some of the quality steps. That's what we're talking about, just incremental, just those small incremental changes. It's not that we're coming in and saying, you know, well, your project manager is going to get fired and the team's, you know, the team's going to magically be self-organizing tomorrow, you know, whatever. That's really not what we're talking about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I would, maybe to throw it back, you're saying you can change the columns that you have, you can change what it means to move from column to column, and you can even change the limits that you're placing on columns. Would you suggest making one change at a time? And like, how do I get the feedback? How do I know whether it was a good change or not?
Yep. So, yeah. So absolutely, everything that you said is true. In terms of the feedback, this gets back to this concept of measuring and managing our flow. There are all kinds of tools that we have to measure and manage flow, and those metrics are going to give us the feedback that we're looking for. Do we make one change at a time or several changes? My thought on that is when a team is first starting out with this, you guys are probably going to make a ton of changes because this board right here represents a model. I'm going to hate to break it to you, but especially when you're starting out, whatever the initial model that you come up with to visualize your work is going to be wrong. Right? And so you guys, this should be a living, breathing thing. It shouldn't be some static thing that never changes. And the feedback for that change is how you're measuring your flow through the system. Are our cycle times getting better? Is our quality getting better? Is our overall work in progress going up or down? Things like that.
Thank you. Back to your point about acceptance test-driven development, one of the ways that we try to implement that is by having a developer or a pair of developers along with the tester assigned to a given story at the same time. So using that in the Scrum context, there's one card with both names on it at the same time, so that the tester is writing the test plans and the stories are hopefully small enough that they can kind of do their work together. In this case, though, it implies the tester won't begin anything until the development is done. And I guess I don't think that's the right implication, so I just wonder if you might be able to explain how you would fit that into this system.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So I don't know if you guys picked up on that. I mean, there's a subtlety there. What we almost certainly are not suggesting here is that in the analysis column only analysis activities happen, or in the development column only development activities happen. It could possibly be that in your world that's exactly what is going on, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about, and that's why it's so important to get those policies down. You know, I don't want these things to be seen as, you know, siloed bits of activity with specialized resources. Again, that could be your world, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So in here, in this, if you wanted to call this an analysis step, you know, it could be all kinds of things. You could have developers working in here. You could have testers working in here. You could have, you know, UE people working in here. There's nothing to say that only, you know, traditional analysis is done in the analysis column. The second thing is, you know, I guess, you know, remember that this is an example, and this is actually a fairly, you know, I called it a simple example, but it is fairly elaborate. I've seen boards as simple as, you know, that look a lot more like traditional Scrum boards: to do, doing, and done. If that's your workflow, then that's your workflow, and that might be good enough to get you started as well. In which case, you necessarily wouldn't have those problems of, you know, hey, what do we do? You know, are only analysts working in analysis or things like that? So I want to get that point across, and maybe I probably should have made that earlier in the talk, is that, you know, this isn't about, a lot of people will call this example mini waterfall, and that's really not what we're talking about right here. A lot of people, their objection is, you know, Dan, hey, this looks like mini waterfall. And I don't know, how much time do we have? I actually want to talk about that. 8 minutes? Yeah. I want to talk about, you know, hey, this is mini waterfall, just very quickly. The problem with waterfall wasn't that, you know, you did your analysis first, and then you did your development, and then you did your test. The problem with waterfall is that you did all of your analysis first, and then you did all your development, and then you did all of your test. And oh, by the way, you fixed your scope that whole way, and as you learned more stuff throughout the process, as you learned stuff in analysis, you couldn't change that scope because it was fixed. The problem with waterfall was a batch size problem. Right? It wasn't necessarily that you shouldn't do analysis first and then development first and then test first. Now we know that there might even be better ways of working rather than doing analysis first and development first and test and then test. So as you can see here, we're not talking about waterfall in the traditional sense of the word, because based on the point that I just made, that you could have several concurrent activities happening in here, what we're not saying is you have to get all of this analysis work done before we can pass it off to development. If this thing is done, then it can flow through the system. And if this thing is done, it can flow through the system. Without fixing scope, you see how we've reduced our batch size. And it turns out that reduction of our batch size is one of the largest improvements we can make in our system. Most people don't know, but the success of Scrum is not necessarily the time box. Well, it is the time boxing, but it's from a batch perspective. Those time boxes introduce batches and get those batch sizes down. I like to talk about Scrum as a lean reaction to waterfall, because that's essentially what it is. They don't talk about, Scrum doesn't use a language of lean, but it's essentially a lean approach to waterfall. Okay, if there are no more questions then, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming. I appreciate the invitation. Thanks to the organizers of the conference for putting this on. Thank you.